Today I want to share with you a story that will chill you to the bone. It's the story of Michael Harrison from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a man whose family was torn apart by a prophecy that never came true. Picture this: you're 15 years old, and your father comes home one day and announces he's selling the house. Why? Because a religious organization has convinced him that the world will end in 1975, and there's no point in planning for a future that won't exist. Michael was that 15-year-old boy. He watched his father, a respected elder in their Jehovah's Witness congregation, make a decision that would haunt their family for decades. They said goodbye to neighbors who looked at them with pity and confusion. Michael dropped out of high school, convinced that education was pointless when Armageddon was just around the corner. The family waited and waited for Jehovah to bring about the end of this world and usher in paradise. But Armageddon never came. 50 years later, Michael still carries the scars of that lie: the broken family relationships, the lost opportunities, and the deafening silence from a God he was taught to trust without question. This is his story, and it's a story that thousands of families lived through during one of the most devastating false prophecies in modern religious history. To understand Michael's story, we need to go back to the 1960s and early 1970s, when the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, began spreading what would become known as the 1975 doctrine. It wasn't officially proclaimed as absolute truth, but the message was unmistakable. The end of the world was coming in 1975, and faithful Jehovah's Witnesses needed to prepare. The Watchtower publications were filled with chronological charts, biblical calculations, and what they called proof that 6,000 years of human history would conclude in 1975, marking the beginning of Christ's 1,000-year reign on earth. Circuit overseers traveled from congregation to congregation, delivering talks that reinforced this timeline. The message was clear and urgent. It wasn't just a suggestion, Michael recalls. It was our future mapped out for us. They told us, don't go to college, there's no time. Don't have children. Why bring them into a world that's about to end? Don't save money for retirement. You won't need it. The end is too close. For families like the Harrisons, this wasn't just religious doctrine. It was a complete life philosophy that governed every major decision they made. The organization had spoken, and questioning wasn't just discouraged. It was seen as a lack of faith, even apostasy. Michael's father, Robert Harrison, was what you'd call a true believer. As an elder in their Cedar Rapids congregation, he was respected, looked up to, and completely devoted to the Watchtower's teachings. When the 1975 message reached its peak intensity around 1973, Robert made a decision that would change his family's life forever. I remember the day Dad came home from a circuit assembly, Michael tells us. His eyes had this strange light in them, part excitement, part fear. He gathered us all in the living room and announced that we were selling the house. Not because we were moving to a bigger one, but because we needed to simplify our lives for the short time remaining in this system of things. Within months, the Harrison family had sold their comfortable 3-bedroom home in a middle-class neighborhood. They moved to a small rental apartment near the Kingdom Hall, using the money from the house sale to support their increased theocratic activities. Robert quit his job as a supervisor at a local factory and began pioneering, spending 90 hours a month going door to door with the Watchtower message. Michael, who had been a decent student with dreams of maybe becoming an engineer, dropped out of high school at 16. Why finish school, his father reasoned, when you could be saving lives by preaching about the coming paradise? Michael's mother, Patricia, cried herself to sleep many nights, but she never dared voice her doubts. In the Jehovah's Witness culture, questioning your husband's spiritual decisions was tantamount to questioning Jehovah himself. The family's younger children, Michael's 12-year-old sister Sarah and 8-year-old brother David, didn't fully understand what they were losing. They were told they were the lucky ones, the generation that wouldn't have to grow up in this wicked world. They would transition directly from childhood into paradise. Everything in the Harrison household revolved around that date, 1975. Family discussions centered on what paradise would be like. They studied Watchtower publications that painted vivid pictures of playing with lions, eating perfect fruit, and being reunited with dead relatives. The anticipation was intoxicating, and it made the sacrifices feel meaningful. As 1975 progressed, the anticipation in Jehovah's Witness congregations worldwide reached fever pitch. Some families literally waited on rooftops for Armageddon to begin. Others gathered in kingdom halls for special prayer meetings, expecting divine intervention at any moment. The Harrison family spent September 1975 in a state of constant expectation. "I remember checking the news every day," Michael recalls. "We were looking for signs, wars, earthquakes, famines, anything that might signal that Jehovah's day had arrived. When October came and nothing had happened, there was this emptiness. This silence that felt heavier than any sound I've ever heard." The silence from the Watchtower organization was deafening. No official statement, no explanation, no apology. Congregation meetings continued as if nothing had happened. Elders gave talks about maintaining faith during difficult times, but they never directly addressed the failed prophecy that had upended so many lives. "The world didn't end," Michael says, his voice still carrying the pain of that realization decades later. "But our lives did." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Michael's father, who had been so confident, so sure of his spiritual standing, became a different man. He stopped commenting during Watchtower studies. He would sit in meetings staring straight ahead, his face a mask of confusion and quiet desperation. The man who had sold everything for his faith now seemed to question everything he had believed. The years following 1975 were perhaps more damaging to the Harrison family than the false prophecy itself. The Watchtower organization eventually acknowledged that there had been overenthusiasm and misplaced expectations among some Jehovah's Witnesses, but they never took full responsibility for the doctrine they had promoted. Robert Harrison never recovered from the spiritual and emotional whiplash. He became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours reading and rereading Watchtower publications, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. He developed what we might now recognize as depression, though mental health was rarely discussed in Jehovah's Witness circles. Seeking therapy would have been seen as a lack of faith in Jehovah's ability to heal all wounds. Patricia Harrison's grief was different but equally profound. She had watched her family sacrifice their security, their children's education, and their future for a promise that never materialized. But in the Jehovah's Witness culture of the 1970s, women had limited voice in spiritual matters. She couldn't express her anger or disappointment without being labeled as spiritually weak or rebellious. Michael's younger siblings bore perhaps the heaviest burden. Sarah, who had been pulled out of extracurricular activities and friendships to focus on the truth, struggled to reconnect with peers when she eventually returned to school. David, the youngest, had missed crucial developmental years when play and learning should have been priorities. Instead, he had spent those years in kingdom halls and door-to-door service, preparing for a paradise that never came. Many families in their congregation began quietly leaving the organization. Some moved away without explanation. Others simply stopped attending meetings, becoming what Jehovah's Witnesses call inactive. But for those who remained, like the Harrisons, speaking openly about their disappointment was impossible. Questioning the organization's teachings was considered apostasy, punishable by complete shunning from family and friends who remained faithful. Michael himself began to see the cracks in the foundation of beliefs he had been raised on. As he entered his 20s, still living at home and working odd jobs because he lacked education or job skills, he started asking dangerous questions. If the organization could be wrong about 1975, what else might they be wrong about? If they were God's channel of communication, why hadn't God corrected their mistake? By his mid-20s, Michael had made the painful decision to leave the Jehovah's Witness organization. It wasn't a choice made lightly. He knew it would cost him his relationship with his family. In the Jehovah's Witness practice of disfellowshipping and shunning, family members who remain in the organization are required to cut off all contact with those who leave. Walking away meant losing everything I had ever known, Michael explains. My parents, my siblings, my entire social circle, everyone I loved was still inside the organization. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't sit in those meetings and act like 1975 hadn't happened, like we hadn't been lied to. Michael moved to Chicago, where he worked construction jobs during the day and attended community college at night, trying to build the education he had been denied as a teenager. It was a lonely, difficult time. He had no friends outside the organization, no social skills for navigating the worldly society he had been taught to fear and avoid. Meanwhile, his family remained trapped in a cycle of spiritual confusion and denial. His father never regained his former confidence in the organization, but he also never found the courage to leave. He remained a Jehovah's Witness until his death in 2003, a broken man who had given everything to a promise that was never kept. Patricia Harrison developed severe anxiety and depression in her later years. She had periodic doubts about the organization but was too afraid to voice them, even to her husband. She passed away in 2018, having spent over 40 years living with the disappointment of 1975 but never feeling free to process that trauma openly. Michael's siblings took different paths. Sarah eventually left the organization in her 30s, after her own children began asking questions she couldn't answer about why their grandparents wouldn't speak to their father. The family reunion between Michael and Sarah after 20 years of enforced separation was emotional beyond description. David, the youngest, remains a Jehovah's Witness to this day. He has never married, never had children, and works as a janitor while spending most of his free time in religious activities. He maintains that 1975 was a test of faith, and that those who left the organization failed that test. He hasn't spoken to Michael in over 30 years. Today, Michael Harrison is 68 years old. He's built a successful life outside the organization that once controlled every aspect of his existence. He married a wonderful woman who helped him learn to trust again, raised 2 children who have never known the fear and control he grew up with, and even managed to build a successful small business despite his limited early education. But the scars remain. Sometimes I lie awake at night and think about who I might have been, he says. What if I had finished high school? What if I had gone to college? What if my family had never heard of 1975? I try not to dwell on it, but the what-ifs are always there. Michael's story is not unique. Thousands of families were devastated by the 1975 prophecy. Many never recovered. Children grew up without proper education, families lost their savings and homes, and countless people suffered psychological trauma that lasted decades. Some estimates suggest that over 1 million Jehovah's Witnesses left the organization in the years following 1975, though exact numbers are difficult to verify since the Watchtower doesn't publish statistics on departures. What makes Michael's story particularly heartbreaking is the organization's response, or lack thereof. The Watchtower Society never issued a formal apology for the 1975 doctrine. They never acknowledged the families they destroyed or the lives they derailed. In their publications, they characterized the disappointment as the result of overeager individual members rather than organizational teaching. They called it misplaced expectations, Michael says, his voice still carrying the weight of that betrayal. But we didn't place those expectations on ourselves. They gave them to us. They told us to trust them as God's voice on earth, and then when their prophecy failed, they blamed us for believing them too much. The silence from the organization's leadership was perhaps the most damaging aspect of the entire experience. No accountability, no acknowledgement of the harm caused, no support for the families whose lives had been shattered by following their guidance. 1975 didn't destroy the world, Michael concludes. It destroyed lives. Real people, real families, real futures. And the silence from the top? That was the loudest judgment of all. It told us that our suffering didn't matter, that our sacrifice meant nothing, and that the organization cared more about protecting its reputation than healing the wounds it had caused. As Michael's story shows us, the real tragedy of false prophecy isn't just the disappointment when predictions fail. It's the human cost of the decisions people make while believing those predictions are true. It's the education never received, the relationships never formed, the dreams never pursued, all sacrificed for a promise that was never kept. Today, Michael speaks openly about his experience, hoping that his story might help others who are struggling with similar situations. He's learned to find peace despite the losses, to build meaningful relationships despite his difficult start, and to trust his own judgment despite years of being taught not to question authority. But he'll never get back those formative years, never get back the relationship with his parents, never know what his life might have been if his family hadn't believed in a prophecy that destroyed them long before the world was ever supposed to end.